Next, please. There is, however, a danger that advocates of narrower impact approaches will press to redefine policy measures so that they become evaluable. So if methods only work with certain types of policies, how do we redesign policies so that they can be evaluated by these methods? That's the kind of logic. And in fact, Duflo went on to say in the same article that I'm quoting from, that it may be desirable for efficiency or political reasons to disperse some fraction of aid in this form, general budget support, although it would be extremely costly to distribute all the foreign aid in the form of general budget support, precisely because it leaves no place for rigorous evaluation of projects. And I think that's quite, again, an important statement, because it emphasizes that delicate risk. On the one hand, one recognizes that methods don't work everywhere, but on the other hand, one would like to live in a world where the methods were more widely applicable for reasons of wanting to achieve a degree of certainty and rigor in measuring outcomes. Next, please. In international development, there is a tendency for advocates of impact approaches to also favor sectoral targeted programs, what are sometimes called vertical interventions, targeted programs to address problems of HIV and AIDS, or education, or dealing with extremes of poverty, rather than policies that seek to address wider issues of governance and institution building, such as things like general budget support or the Paris Declaration, and arguing that sectoral programs are both likely to be more effective and are often cheaper to deliver. And this is a debate given particular urgency because of the concerns around making some progress around Millennium Development Goals. So there is quite a clear correlation, if you look at the literature and if you look at people's orientations, that those who favor the narrower impact approach also tend to favor these vertical programs and be very skeptical about large-scale governance types of reforms. And it's a real tension, because we have a lot of evidence that focused interventions, let's say around HIV, do make an enormous difference. And we also have a lot of evidence that the sustainability of change is very difficult to achieve unless one does address issues of governance. So that tension is reflected also in the methodological community around these kinds of issues. Next, please. The philosophical objections to experiments, and randomization in particular, go to the heart of some very serious debates about causality in the social sciences. I say them briefly. They're epistemological, they're ontological, they're methodological, but I'm going to pick up just a few of them. Next, please. Newtonian science assumes that we can observe regularities or patterns of individual phenomena from the outside, and that this allows consistent explanations, and that explanations can be derived empirically. That whole worldview is at the heart of what John briefly defined as a kind of a positivist view of the world, and it is a view of the world that emphasizes regularities, but emphasizes that they can be understood empirically. Most contemporary understandings of causality, and I would say this is a consensus across the philosophy of science, there are very few outside of particular policy communities who would still adhere to that, are theory-based and assume that we cannot observe causal mechanisms, that we need to open up the black box, as it's called, A, because causal mechanisms are often hidden, and B, because they're often unstable, they're context-specific and they change in different contexts. Hence the difficulty in finding general laws that we can say this works under all circumstances. So that's a very important stream of thinking in philosophy of science, which makes one think carefully and cautiously about the circumstances under which one can expect to have causal explanations from most kinds of evaluative activity, and in particular those that concentrate mainly on the external. Now, it's worthwhile just emphasizing here there's a difference here between cause and explanation. What random control trials can do very well in the limited circumstances to which they can be applied is that they can tell us that something is causing something. What they can't do is explain what the mechanisms are that are bringing this about. That's why the more sensible people say we need to do the both. We need to do theory-based stuff, looking inside the mechanisms to try to understand why this is happening, as well as looking at the big ends to try to find out what is causing what. Next, please. If we follow this line of argument, it is unlikely that we'll ever be able to consistently demonstrate what works, even for relatively straightforward projects and programs, across all contexts and circumstance. Evidence remains a matter of probability and estimation, and not certainty or truth. It's quite interesting the way the discourse and the rhetoric of evidence-based policy has evolved in our community, certainly in the evaluation community, and I suppose to some extent in yours. I remember having dinner in the early days of this debate with a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and he turned around in the middle of the evening and said, "The trouble with you social scientists is that you think evidence is truth." He says, we lawyers think evidence is something you stick up in court and you shoot to pieces because it's not to be trusted. And that is quite interesting, how the word evidence-based policy has in fact become assumed to say something about truth rather than a hypothesis about a possibility, maybe a probability, something that needs to continuously be investigated. Next, please. Which is why there is a need for multi-methods that can be triangulated, theory-based approaches to understand mechanisms that cannot be fully observed, distinguish between causality and explanation, recognize the limits of proof and certainty, understand and typologize contexts. I think this is the major criticism that I think you can direct against the evaluation community around this debate. We always say context matters. We always say it depends on the context. What is remarkable is how little effort has been spent studying contexts. So the possibilities of building typologies of contexts, the possibilities of trying to understand within what sets of domains is it possible to generalize is there, but we invest very little time in it. Linking process evaluation with outcome evaluations so that A, we understand what is being implemented, and B, what accounts for divergence or diversity. Next, please. The ethical difficulties, which is my final consideration, that all applied research faces are well documented and well understood, and I'm sure are well understood in this community. It's about treating people as actors with agency and will rather than passive objects. So, for example, in the international development field, there is a real problem around principles of ownership, autonomy, and self-determination, which are built into many of the principles of documents like the Paris Declaration and the Comprehensive Development Framework and others, whilst at the same time trying to allocate people and control and make differentiations between different groups. Denying an intervention from some if it is needed in order to achieve randomization. There are these kinds of objections. Some of them are real and some of them I think can be addressed. For example, the latter one about randomization being denying a treatment, so to speak, can be consistent with a counterfactual, it can be consistent with a counterfactual logic to offer alternative services rather than no service, for example. And also it's important to realize that many experiments are focusing not on the service but on the mode of delivery. And to that extent, it's quite possible to vary the mode of delivery without falling into this particular ethical trap. On the other hand, I'm not denying that the ethical issues are pretty important and also need to be considered. Next, please. So to conclude, what I've been trying to argue is that we do need to focus more on outcomes, effects, and impacts. That comparisons, including experiments, are important, as are modeling and theory building. That we need to accept that as initiatives become more complex and multi-measure, so certainty and predictability about what works will diminish. As you go up the scale from projects to programs to strategies to policies, it becomes less easy to apply rigorous methods and less easy to be sure that we know what's happening. But we should neither be put off or seduced by the promises of experimentalists. They offer many things in a limited set of circumstances, as the wise ones among them do admit. Thank you very much.